How you doing, Ann? Um, yeah, so here in Boileau, it is 27 degrees Celsius. It's absolutely balmy. It's tropical weather conditions out there. It's a little bit of wind. And here is growing crazy, growing profusely. The tomatoes, the beans, the peas, the winter squash, the melons, all climbing and vining. We've had abundant harvests of Camarisier or Hascap berries, lettuce, radishes, salad, turnips, green onions, garlic flowers, climbing beans, peas. Now we're starting to harvest the first of the cherry tomatoes and zucchinis. Fresh herbs we're bringing in like oregano and mint and lemon balm to dry for the winter time, as well as chamomile and sacred basil, coriander, dill. So we're entering the time of the plenty. It's really, really beautiful out there. It's my hope that your gardens are also doing well. So in order to kick off today's show about seed saving and everything, all our plants going to flower, the thing that I can say that's most important is the more flowers, the better. The more flowering plant diversity will dictate more floral and faunal diversity within our gardening systems. And our ancestors knew all of this. They knew that if they were to let certain plants go to seed that they found tasty, they found good, then they would proliferate. And this is kind of how agriculture came to being. So when we became more sedentary from our nomadic ways, this is when agriculture really took hold, right? So there's anthropological evidence to suggest that peoples in the Middle East were cultivating certain kinds of grains over 100,000 years ago, and they're now able to find all this information because of previously flooded cave sites or archaeological sites that, because of climate change and because of the droughts in those regions, the water is dissipating, and they're finding these underground sort of vessels that have seeds in them, or they have these grains that they didn't think existed back then, but voila, here they are. It is also how we got our very important three sisters crops, our corn, our beans, and our squash or pumpkins from South America. They started really, really tall. I mean, really, really small. Imagine corn was as big as half of my pinky finger. And that's pretty cool. To what we're eating today, that big sweet corn that really, really like, or that wonderful heirloom milling corn that gets still really big with big kernels. It all started small. So it's kind of, there we go. That brings us right into today's show, which is seed saving simplified. Why, how, top 10, everybody should be seed saving. I had a question, and this has actually come up many times over the last month. And it is about the show that we had last time, which is about insect maintenance. And it is about grubs. Some people call them grubs. Some people call them cutworms. They're actually called gray worms. And what they are the larval stage of a night hawk moth. So the moths that fly around at night, if you ever keep an outside light on, the moths are there. Well, they then lay their eggs basically in the fall, and through the winter, they stay dormant. And in the spring, they hatch and they become the larvae. They start really, really small, and then they get bigger over time as they start eating our gardens and everything else green. So the question that came up is, what do I do about them? How do I get rid of them? And it is about, we need to hand pick them, unfortunately. Now, what I have found is that they're really, really pervasive in the early spring. They really go after brassica crops specifically. I'm just going to check something. It looks like there's messages coming in, but I can't see them. Well, I can't see them for some reason. I don't know why. Okay, anyway, continuing on. So, yeah, the best thing that we can do for that is whenever we plant our transplants or we plant our seeds, if we just disturb the soil a little bit, usually they'll come to the surface and we'll be able to hand pick them out. If they're eating our crops, we need to dig around our little seedlings and check and see if they're there. What I have found as the most pervasive problem, and the reason why they exist in some capacity or major capacity is when people use a lot of really dry or really spoiled hay mulch. So the Ruth Stout method says to go ahead and use like 12 or 14 inches of dry straw or wet straw. What I found is that the larvae really like being in there, and it makes sense because the larvae cannot be attacked by predators like birds, like other ground beetles that are just not going down in to eat those larvae. So if you are planting your transplants and you have this system of using a lot of dry sort of straw mulch, go ahead and just task it out of the way, put your transplant and dig around and just make sure there are none there. And just check your plants every morning. That's what we do. And if you find that they're eating a few leaves, that's usually where they start. Dig around and you'll usually find them. Pull them out, feed them to the American robins or any other thrushes you have. All right, I'm going to continue. We have a really huge show and it's going to be tough to get through it all. So we're going to give it a shot. So why should we save our own seeds? First of all, to even start off, in order to be able to seeds, plants must first have gone to flower. And this is benefit number one. All flowers will attract some insect friend. The smaller the flowers, like those from cilantro plants, will attract the smallest native bees, hoverflies, and wasps. The larger flowers, like winter squashes, will attract the largest bees and bumbleflies. Some flowers, even like the large, showy bell-shaped digitalis plant, which is a biennial, will invite in hummingbirds and sphinx moths, which are very cool. Benefit number two, by many different plants go to flower all throughout the season will give these creatures nourishment the entire time, closing the gap between our cultivated lands and our wild ones. So what we're going to try and do in our systems is we want to try to create a complete year of flowering plants. So every month as it starts from May all the way until, or in some places in March or February, all the way until here, October, or in some places November, December, we want to make sure that there are flowers that all of those small and larger pollinating insects want. Because it's not just for our specific crops that we need these pollinating insects. We want these pollinating insects for all of the wild flowers and wild trees like wild apple trees or choke cherries or wild blueberries, because all of these plants need to have pollinators as well. If we have those pollinators around, then they will go ahead and create food sources for themselves for later by pollinating, which creates, and also for our own plants. So in our gardens right now, what do we have flowering? Like right at this moment here on July 11th, ruby streaks, we have digitalis, we have onions that are blooming, valerian, and then biennial carrots that we're doing for seed, beets for seed, as well as honeysuckle, which is a beautiful plant that also the hummingbirds like. We have parsnips for seed, as well as potatoes, squashes, and tomatoes. This is all this flowering right at this moment. In the wilds, we have all heel, clover, 3 different kinds. We have red clover, we have strawberry clover, and we have white clover. Daisy, vetch, sorrel, white blueberries, raspberries, choke cherries, So just to bring it all home once again, the more faunal and insect diversity. If there was ever any doubt what came first, the plant or the animal, all faunal and insect life follows plant life. So it was the plant that crossed the road first. Well. Number 3 benefit, saving seeds increases genetic diversity, purity, and vigor. For example, heirloom seeds, which have the designation of having been saved for 3 or more generations, have an understanding. I'm just going to look at this again because I don't know why. Let's put it like this. No, doesn't work. Ah, there it is. Let's try that. Huh. I don't know. If there's anybody out there who's trying to make comments for whatever reason, that's not working. Anyway, I'm sorry about that. We'll just continue. So heirloom seeds have the designation of having been saved for 3 or more generations, and they have an understanding of over 75 garden years. Here in Quebec, we are never sure of what the summer will be like. Sometimes it's going to be hot and dry, like 2020. Sometimes mild and wet, like 2022. Sometimes hot and wet, like this year, 2023. But when we save seed year after year, no matter the climatic conditions, the seed will have information stored from all the past growing experiences. She will know also how to build immunity against bacterial, fungal, and viral infections that the plants had grown through in the past. In Arizona, I had a really interesting problem. There was a leaf hopper. It was a migrating insect that came up every year, and it really enjoyed tomato plants. So it would bite the tomato plant, and it would emit their saliva on the plant and would call curly top virus. I'm going to just mention again, if you're out there and you're trying to leave a message, that is not working. So, wait, maybe I can figure this out. Would kill the tomato plant outright. So I did some research and I found that if we were to, there was a university out of Oregon that was growing a few varieties, curly top resistant varieties of tomatoes. They were open pollinated. They weren't heirloom, but they were open pollinated. So we could get the seed, plant the plants, and then save the seed year after year. And supposedly, if the leafhoppers came up and they bit that tomato plant, that there wouldn't be any damage, any curling of the tomato plant at all. And lo and behold, in the first year, it was true. Those particular plants, one was called Ropac, one was called Columbia, the plants thrived while all the heirloom, like the Brandywine, the Cherokee Purple, they all withered away and died in the field. So there is specific documentation, there is specific research being done onto if we can go ahead and save seed from infected plants or certain insects as well as infected plants. And this is how we can save seed ourselves. Benefit number 4, saving seeds will save you money as a gardener and can become an income stream for the homestead. Seeds, just like everything else, are expensive and they're getting more and more so. Finding varieties that you once liked may or may not be available. Recently, in the last 2 years, I have observed the germination rates from small and larger seed houses have fallen dramatically. I believe it is because that they have overstocks rolling from year to year. There was a lot of demand right after the pandemic in 2020 for people to start their own gardens. And then a couple of years later, all of a sudden, there was no demand, or the demand really diminished. So farmers and seed house and small scale seed companies and even big, large scale seed companies, they stock their shelves full of seeds. And when those seeds didn't sell, now they have to try to sell them. Well, germination rates go down year after year after year based on our storage. So it is very, very possible that they were using older seed. But what I've noticed is that germination rates have really diminished over the last few years. If we save our own from year to year, we can ensure that we have viable seed banks. Veganic seed companies are even more rare than veganic farms. Learning this ancient tradition is inherent in our souls. For the few $100s a year, one can build a website and sell online. If you live in Canada, from January to May, there are Seedy Saturdays, which are very popular seed festivals throughout the country. So get into it. If you have a desire, it's a really lucrative, it can be a really lucrative part of your business plan as a homesteader. If you're just doing this for your own benefit, for the benefit of the beings around you, let the plants go to flower, save the seed, then you have your own seed stock. You don't even need to buy any the year after. There you go. So how do we do this? Well, there are 2 sources that are really, really good. The first one is a book called Seed to Seed by Susan Ashworth. This is the Seed Savers Bible. It is absolutely wonderful. It talks about all regions in the United States and Canada, talks about basically everything that you could possibly seed, fruits, vegetables, herbs, everything that you can think of. Check it out. You can really find it anywhere. It's a brilliant resource. One of our really good veganic farmers in the world, he's a veganic homesteader, Will Bonsall, was a consultant on this book. So again, Seed to Seed by Susan Ashworth. Check it out. And of course, my book, The Veganic Grower's Handbook, chapter 16 is all dedicated to letting plants go to flower, to seed, and saving them. So if you don't have my book, check it out. There's a really good section on that. And I talk about seed saving principles in there as well. Here are the top 10. Everyone should be seed saving and are relatively easy based on popularity. Before we begin that, 2 basic points to understand. A perfect flower, where the stamen and the pistil are housed in the same flower, should not cross, even if a like family species plant, like 2 different types of tomatoes, like a Cherokee Purple and Brandywine again, are planted side by side. It is what's called inbreeding. The flower itself supposedly is too small for any size bee to get into where it needs to go to then take the pollen out and bring it to another flower. Over 25 years of saving my own tomato seeds, I have found that this is absolutely true. I have yet to have any crossing. This is really a contentious debate among seed savers and growers. Some people say you must separate them, otherwise they'll be crossing. I have yet to see it cross. So take your information for you want. If you do want to be safe, you can separate your tomato plants by just 50 feet, so 15 meters. Now, if the plant has the same species name and the flowers have a separated stamen and pistil, like Cucurbita pepo, which can be some kinds of winter squash and some kinds of summer squash, or Brassica rapa, which is like a bok choy and a purple top turnip, they will cross and must be separated to ensure genetic purity by at least a half a kilometer, which is about a quarter of a mile. These are what's called outbreeding plants. It means that we must have a pollinator go to the male flower and pollinate the female flower. So there you go. So let's get into the ones that we should all be saving. So lettuce, Latuca sativa. Lettuce is the most popular of the seeds that we sell, and we seem to sell out of those yearly. Lettuce is an inbreeding plant, perfect flower. Experts claim that they will not cross when 2 different varieties are planted side by side. So there you go. So you can seed a kind of a lettuce mix of as many different varieties that you want, and you can seed save them all, and all of them are true. If you want to know which is which for your own purposes, well, you plant your heads of, say, magenta lettuce, and then flashy Trout's back, and then a red romaine, and then, say, a gold star, or a red leaf, I'm thinking of the name Red Sails, which is an heirloom. And you can let those go to seed and then seed save each one individually instead of all together as a combined mix. And then you have all the different variety types that you want if you want them separated. And seed saving lettuce, we want to look for adapted varieties that grow fast, leafy and full, but go to flower slowly. If we have our lettuces go to flower too quickly, then we're going to have a problem which is called bolting. Bolting is when the head gets pretty in size, well, not even, sometimes very small, and all of a sudden shoots up its flower stalk. Well, when it does that, usually the lettuce leaves become quite bitter. So what we are looking for are heads of lettuce that stay compact, get big if you prefer, but stay compact and do not go up to flower. They just keep getting more dense and dense and dense until all of a sudden you start seeing in the middle, it starts closing in upon itself. This is it sort of sheltering itself before it's going to set up its sort of its seed stalk, if you will, its flower stalk. So lettuces that go to flower too quickly when the weather warms is not ideal. Generally, red lettuces hold better in the field than greens. Summer crisps and romaines hold better in the field than butterheads because it can become very tricky in really warm climates to get these lettuces to come in. So if you're talking about trying to have a nice head of lettuce that you're saving seed for that you want to keep full as late into the season as possible with your succession planting, then trying reds or summer crisp might be more ideal. You can plant your butterheads in the spring or later in the fall. After flowering, the seeds will develop, and once dry, the flower petals will be less sticky. They can be easily pulled off the plant. So the flower stalk is going to come up and it's going to create all these little multitude of the seeds will sort of look sort of translucent, and then they'll either turn, depending on the variety, black or white. When you see that and pretty much all the from the flower, all the petals come off, then you can start sort of gleaning them off with your fingers and drop them right into the container. Let it dry in sort of a warm, out of the sun place for a few days before packing into envelopes or glass keeping. Very simple. So number one, lettuce. Number two, heirloom tomatoes, Solanum lycopersicum. As a category, these are the most sought after vegetables or fruits are grown because they're very regionally specific. Gardeners are always looking for tomatoes that are well adapted to their environment. And there are characteristics that are more interesting to others. If people are planting outside, sometimes without any kind of cover, sometimes it's easier for people to plant determinate type tomatoes, which are a smaller tomato, as opposed to an indeterminate tomato, which is a very, very tall tomato that requires a cage or a stake. You can also have cherry tomatoes or slicing tomatoes, and then it comes down to color of red or orange or black or green. These are all things to consider when you're saving your own seeds. And for if you're trying to sell productive, you're looking for plants that are producing early, abundant, and that the fruits are tasty, right? When you plant your tomatoes, you can have a nice diverse mix from early season, mid-season, and late season. So as you get a little bit more advanced, it's best not to just have one type. So here we grow a Mountain Princess and Taxi. Those are our early tomatoes. Then mid-season, we have Mortgage Lifter, we have Cherokee Purple, and we have Quebec Tries or Quebec 13. These are all going to be mid-season. So as those Mountain Princesses are starting to fall off a little bit, the other ones pick up the slack and they pull in. And then late, we have Nepal and Valencia and Green Zebra. So then now we have a nice diversity all the way through the season. We can also do this with our Italian tomatoes, like our Roma, our San Marzano, and our Amish paste. The Romas are very early, San Marzano's next, Amish paste late. And so when we're doing our canning, we usually do aromas the first batch, and then as it goes, we have more and more. But this just gives you also the opportunity to sort of combat. Sometimes we have fluctuations in temperature that can cause late blight or early blights or, all right, so that is working. Hello, Margaret, welcome. So sometimes we have early blights and sometimes we have verticillium wilts and these things happen periodically, no matter where we live. So if we have different seasonal tomatoes, maybe the early tomatoes will get hit a little harder with those diseases, but then the medium tomatoes and the mid-season and the late season won't. There you go. Things to consider when you're thinking about tomatoes. And this is all, when you're looking at seed catalogs or when you're looking online at seed companies, it'll usually say the amount of days to harvest from transplant. So a 60-day tomato is very early. Take at least 2 to 3, 4 is fine, from at least 3 different for genetic diversity. Now, inbreeding plant a perfect flower, what most seed savers will suggest is you must have at least 10 plants for genetic diversity. I'm going to bust out this myth right now about all inbreeding plants. So let's say we're talking about heirlooms again, and this is a plant that has been saved, or a tomato that has been saved for 75 years, 3 generations. So every time you plant a seed, it has 75 years worth of genetic information within its core. That is a lot of genetic diversity. So if you only save 3 or 4, let's say you save most 7, 8 tomatoes, well, that 7 or 8 tomatoes is going to have all of that genetic diversity from the year, plus the genetic diversity from 75 years ago, and every year in between. All of that information, it's all stored in the seed. The seed knows. Every year it compounds. It's not like you plant the seed, all of a sudden the seed forgets. Oh, what was I? I don't remember. Okay, now I know I'm a Brandywine. No, it doesn't work like that. Seeds have all that information. They know all of that data. They know what the climate was like 75 years ago. I wasn't born then. I don't know what it was like 75 years ago. That is pretty cool. That's what happens. So even though the recommendation is have 10 plants, I don't do that. I say from 5 or 6 because that's all we have the space for, to be able to have the diversity in our seed catalog. So I think you can do the same and everything would just be fine. The thing that you want to look for with the tomatoes, you want to make sure that the tomatoes are perfect as possible. You don't really want a lot of blemishes on the tomato. You don't want them deformed, because if you do that, then there is going to be a tendency for now that to be in its genetic code. Interestingly, that's why you find with heirloom tomatoes a lot of deformity within the fruits. The deformity is because people have seed saved those deformities over the years. I mean, sometimes it could be a nutrient deficiency. That's true, or some sort of an insect damage. But most of the time, it's because it was seed saved from a non-perfect fruit. So if you are looking to sort of make the genetic diversity of those coming seeds that you're going to be planting next year from those tomatoes more profound, then save from the most perfect fruit you can. And this goes for everything. Save from the most perfect plants, most beautiful plants. Those are green, lush, and healthy. You're going to have best success with your own seeds. Well, so once you grab your tomato, you cut it in half. You scoop out the seeds. You can use your finger. You can use a spoon, whatever you want, and liquid into a glass jar. So whatever that level is, fill it with an equal amount of water, stir it around, and let it ferment in a warm place. And it can even be in the sun, it's no problem, until a white-green algae forms. This is the gelatinous sac that holds the seed, which inhibits the seed from actually germinating. But it also protects it in the field. So if a tomato were to fall off and it was going to germinate out in the soil, then that gelatinous sac would hold on to it for a little and protect it until the winter passes, the cold times pass, the wet passes, and then all of a sudden that coating sort of melts away, and then the seeds come. But if that coating is still on there, then that seed is going to rot if you try to save it. So make sure that white-green algae forms about 4 or 5 days. Remove the algae, swish with cold water, draining off until all the seeds settle to the bottom. Scatter onto a piece of copy paper. You like to use copy paper because it's nice and strong. And let dry, and then package into an envelope. Always remember to label your seeds with the name, whatever characteristics, and how many seeds you think are in there, and the date, or at best the year. You're going to want to do a germination test of your seeds later on. This is just to ensure that your seeds are viable, so that if you don't buy seeds, you actually have your own viable stock, right? So again, when you package your seeds, make sure you put the name, whatever characteristics you want to say, like a beautiful plant, prolific, earliest. You can also write the amount of days to harvest from the transplant and the type of tomato. So you can say, 58 days or 64 days, whatever. And then write it how many seeds, and make sure you put the year, so that when you put them in your box of seeds or your containers of seeds, or like us, 5 containers of seeds, then you will always use the oldest ones first, or you use the ones that you like the characteristics of. Good. Here we go. Number 3, number 4, and kind of number 5. Bush beans, dry beans, soybeans, and climbing beans. Phaseolus vulgaris, that is your bush beans, dry beans, and climbing beans. And glycine max, soybeans. As vegans, beans are the highest protein source of all the veggies we grow, and they're very easy to save. And interestingly, when you save a dry bean, it's exactly the same thing as you would eat, right? So you want to save them for your eating, and you want to save them to replant the year after. These are also in-beating plants, all perfect flowers, so they will not cross. This is rare. There are some people that claim that beans will cross, but again, because for whatever reason, tomato plants, the bees like them, the lettuce, the pepper plants, the bees like them, but bean plants, the bumblebees really like the flowers, and so they're in there collecting whatever pollen they can get to. But it doesn't seem to transfer from one plant to another. But they do like being in there. So experts do say it rarely happens. Again, if you want to be sure, separate by 50 feet. When planting a patch for seed and harvesting fresh, best to let a portion go to seed and a portion to harvest. So let's say you have some that you know that you want to save seed from. Let's say you have a Maxi Bell green bean, but you also want to eat them. Well, sort of delineate with a wooden stake a place where you're just going to harvest from. Because once you harvest, it will create more pods, but the plants become pretty beat up once you harvest the first or second time. And then the plants will tend to fall on themselves. And when you do create seed pods that are trying to dry, they could fall into the wet earth. If you let a section that you are trying to save seed from just go, and don't touch them at all until they're dry, well, then the plants usually will stay quite upright, unless you're having deluges of rain like we've been having here, and all throughout Quebec we've been having. It'll just hold the beans a little bit better for you. So 2 separate patches as you wish, one to eat from, to harvest from all the time or every few days, like you do need to harvest beans, or letting them go to dry where the pods get completely dry. So that's it. Once the pods are dry on the vine, brittle, and the seeds are hard inside, you'll know because sometimes the seed, especially if you try to pick them in the morning, the dry pods, the pods themselves might be a little soft. It could be that the seeds are dry in between, but they might be a little soft. Well, if you were to open anything that's a little soft and you were to try to indent the seed with your thumbnail, and if there is an indent in the seed, then it's not dry enough. You need to leave it on the plant. You need to leave them on the plant for a while. They really should be hard. A good method of understanding is if you take out sort of a ceramic bowl with you and you take off a seed pod of a bean and you crack it and it goes in the bowl and it goes plink, 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 then you know it's a good seed. If it goes plunk, plunk, then it's still a little hollow. So plink, it's good. Plunk, that's good. All right, so once you harvest them, you can harvest them in a shallow flat or a bowl. Anything shallow is great. You can also use a cookie sheet, whatever you want. And let dry in the sun out of the threat of rain for a week or longer. After that, they can be cracked by hand and stored in a jar. I've already talked about the fact that you want to seed save from as many different plants as possible from the plants that were healthy at peak production time. But interestingly, if you have a plant, like sometimes here with our tomatoes, we'll have plants that will have that verticillium wilt in the early season or an early blight. And if we do, then we will see what happens with that plant. If that plant grows out of it, becomes bushy and full, creates beautiful tomatoes that are really tasty, well, then we'll seed save them anyway. And what's interesting about that is that just helps the genetic understanding of that plant to be more resistant to verticillium wilt. If you look at seed catalogs, there are always a lot of notations after a seed, especially an F1 hybrid. They'll say like in red, usually like VC, what's another one I'm thinking of? BLS, or so you're talking verticillium wilt or OPM, powdery mildew, or bacterial leaf spot. Well, what they're claiming is when they created the hybrid seed, they're claiming that those plants are now resistant to those diseases. When you look at any plant that's open pollinated, usually they won't say it, or heirloom, they won't say it at all. It's interesting because it's not that they don't. In my head and the way that I've come to understand it, and the way I even wrote about it in my book, is that, excuse me, those heirloom plants have seen all those diseases before. And they've grown out of it because we have all the seed. We have the seed from the last 75 years. So they have been able to understand those diseases, grow out of it, learn from it, and also be resistant from it. So it is a pretty good bet that every heirloom plant will learn how to defend itself from a plant. Didn't work in Arizona with the curly top virus, and it probably doesn't work with other things, as other heirloom plants as well. But those are very rare circumstances. For the most part, heirloom seeds will outcompete F1 hybrid seeds because they have all of that knowledge, all of that data knowledge. All right, that's enough. Some people call this way too metaphysical. I just believe this is exactly what's going on with seeds. So save the most beautiful fruits like tomatoes and peppers, or the most beautiful pods like peas or beans. And that's an interesting one too with peas and beans. So let's say you're saving from a shelling pea. Now there are shelling peas that can get up to 10 peas in a pod. Well, if you seed save from the ones that have 10 peas, then there's a pretty good chance that in the following years, you're going to have peas that have 10 peas. But if you save the ones that maybe only have 3 or 4, then you're going to change the genetics a little bit so that your seed pods are going to be a little bit smaller. Well, the same with beans. If you save beans that are curled, you might end up with more beans that are curled. If you save beans that are short versus long, you might end up with a shorter bean versus a longer bean. This is how we as seed producers sort of become sort of seed breeders with our heirloom seeds, is that we choose the characteristics that we want, and we write these things in our packages. Well, you would do the same. You choose the characteristics that you want, that you're looking for. Early tomatoes, long beans, full potted peas. There you go. Soybeans, it's the exact same thing. And if you don't grow soybeans, they're a kick. Soybeans are amazing. If you've never had actually fresh edamame from either the farmer's market, and it's super hard to find, or out of your own garden, it is a completely different vegetable than you've ever grown before. And just like all the other beans, it's a packed protein source. Edamames are great. You can also dry your soybeans, and you can cook them like dry beans. And then you can make, what did I make this winter? Oh, I had an abundance of black soybeans. It's called a black jet soybean, which we sell on our website. It's an heirloom. And the black jet soybean, I ended up roasting it like soy nuts. You probably have had these before. So you sprinkle them with salt and Mexican seasoning like chili powder and cayenne pepper or whatever, garlic powder, and you roast them until they're crispy. It's a great treat. And so there are ways to use your beans pretty much all the time. And again, full of protein, what we can use, what we want as vegans. Okay, so number 6. Moving on, peppers and hot peppers. Peppers are one of the crops where region adaptability should be taken in full consideration. In the north, generally, the smaller the pepper, the most prolific. So we have better luck with what's called a dough hill, which is an orange pepper that gets about that big. It's sweet. Or a lipstick, which is a small red pepper. Than we do get with the big red bell peppers that you'll find in the grocery store. They just don't do as well for us here in the north. In the south, where I grew in Arizona and where most people grow, southeast or in Texas or in California, or not as humid or not as wet, you can grow those big blocky red bell peppers if you wish. It's always a good idea to have both, because the great thing about the smaller ones is they always come in faster. They're just as sweet. So it's quite fun. Most peppers will be red or orange at the seed saving stage. Jalapenos, a hot pepper, are usually harvested green, but only when they are deep red will the seeds be viable. So once fully colored, cut the pepper lengthwise and remove the seeds by hand for the sweets. With a tip of a paring knife for hots, don't touch the insides with your finger or rub your eyes. all of the hot of a hot pepper is in the white sort of how would you call that? The white interior, I guess, of the pepper and the seeds. So if you are to use your fingers to scrape the seeds out or touch it in any way and then rub your eye, oh, you'll be stinging for a few hours. And you can take those seeds and you scratch them, or with sweet peppers, you can use your hands directly onto copy paper, let them dry. Always let everything dry in a warm, dry place. I like to, and out of the sun, I like to put them on top of my fridge and my top freezer, because that's just a nice warm place out of direct light, and everything will dry wonderfully. And then you can pack it in the envelope, again, with the characteristics, the date, and the name. Number 7, all greens. Greens are all outbreeding plants, so they will all cross between species. So Brassica rapa, like bok choy and rapini, will cross with each other. But an effective mechanism for seed saving different mustard greens side by side is like bok choy, which is a Brassica rapa, ruby streaks, which is a Brassica juncea, and arugula, which is an Aruca sativa, which interestingly are all in the Brassicaceae species family of crops, but they all have different species names. So you can seed save them all and they will not cross. It's exceptionally easy to seed save. You probably, if you've plants and you've let them go to flower, you've probably seen them. So in the case of arugula, really beautiful, sweet smelling white flower, white flowers everywhere on the stem. And then from there, it creates these little greenish pods that end up turning dry, and inside you have your seeds. So you can, the best way is to take a pretty good sized bowl, brittle into the, or pull off the brittle pods, put them into a bowl, crack them with your hands or with your fingers, kind of rubbing them. And the pods will break apart. The seeds will kind of break apart from the chaff. And then you do a really cool process called winnowing. So where the winds are quite mild, during the day when it's quite mild, you can just kind of pour from one bowl to another slowly. So you pour to another bowl, and then all the chaff will float away. But the seeds, because they're heavier, will go right to the bottom. Not when it's too windy, but when there's maybe like a 5 mile per hour or 10 kilometer per hour wind, then you can winnow the bowls back and forth. And eventually you'll have just seed. There you go. And just like everything else, go ahead and package it up after that. Let it go ahead and dry on top of your fridge for a few days. All right, number 8, winter squash or pumpkins. This is one of the best carbohydrate sources of all the plants we grow. There are different species names like Pepo, Maxima, Moschata, etc. These are an outbreeding plant, will readily cross between species, and they must have pollinators. This is why having what we talked about at the beginning of the show, why we must have flowers all the way through until those flowers come on, because there is nothing sadder than if all of a sudden your zucchini plants and your winter squash plants are doing really, really wonderful. And you have all these beautiful flowers, and all of a sudden you don't have any bees. You have male and female flowers, but you have no bees. Well, then you have to get in the habit of pollinating yourself, which you can do. You just take the male flower and you pollinate the male flower to the female flower. But if you prefer to have the bees, both the bumblebees and the small native bees and the hoverflies and the wasps do all this work for you. So since they will all cross, so an acorn squash is a Cucurbita pepo. This will cross with a delicata squash, which is a Cucurbita pepo, with every kind of summer squash and zucchini, which are almost all Cucurbita pepo. So you cannot grow them side by side. Again, you have to have a half-kilometer distance. And if you have bees, if you have a lot of bees, that may not even be enough. But you can plant multiple varieties, and they can be grown directly next to each other and they won't cross. Like delicata, again, which is a cucurbita pepo, with a butternut, a Waltham butternut squash, which is a moschata, a cucurbita moschata, and a pumpkin, which is a cucurbita maxim. So you can grow these side by side. They will not cross, no problem. You can even pollinate one with the other. Very cool. And it will not, it'll create a true pumpkin. If you use the male flower of a delicata squash to a female flower of the pumpkin, for example, you will have a true pumpkin. And then afterwards, when you save the seed, all the seeds will become true Cinderella pumpkins. It's very neat. So winter squash seeds are viable when winter squash is fully formed, colored, and hard at the eating stage. You should cure all your squashes in the sun for a week to 10 days before long-term storage. When cutting to cook, scoop out the seeds, wash off the stringy, sticky ganglions that are there, and let dry on copy paper on top of your fridge, stored in envelopes. So again, it's really, winter squash is a great one because the seeds are ready when you want to eat them. Different than, say, zucchini. If you're trying to seed save from zucchini, you need to get the zucchinis to grow quite a bit bigger than you would ever want to harvest. So we're talking long. We're talking up to 2 feet long, and they want to be hard too. This is when the seeds will be viable. So there you go. A lot easier to harvest winter squash seeds or pumpkin seeds than it is zucchini seeds. But if you want to give it a shot, it's very cool. Again, just watch the species name and make sure they're different if you're planting them side by side. Excellent. Number 9, potatoes. Definitely one of the most important staples we have, and they're extremely easy to save. Potatoes are saved from the tuber. So when you're eating the potato, you're actually eating the seed. You are eating what will become the potato plant. So let's say you've grown potatoes, or let's say you've just bought potatoes and all of a sudden they start growing, they have like from their little eyes, they start putting up little shoots. Well, that's the plant. It's very neat. That's the plant, and that's what you plant, right? And it's very easy to calculate how much seed you need, because let's say you want 15 feet, a 15-foot row, or let's say you want a patch of 15 potato plants. Well, you need 15 seeds. You need 15 potatoes. That's it. And what kind? Well, about like that. About as big as an egg, about as big, a little bit bigger than a golf ball. It's perfectly fine. And usually, if all goes well, from one potato that you plant, you can get up to 15 potatoes. How great is that? So it really depends on your year, your soils, everything else. Very, very easy. When you're storing potatoes, you want to store them dry and dirty and as close to freezing as possible. You want to try to make sure, you want to rub off the mud, but you want to keep some of the dirt. You want to make sure there's no scab. And that's kind of a condition where the skin, and it affects mostly white and yellow potatoes, a little bit less on red potatoes. You'll kind of see it's an off coloration of the skin. It doesn't make the potato go bad, but it could create the genetic diversity that you don't want in your potatoes, which is then that you have scab in your potatoes. And the scab, if it does get really bad in the field, it can end up rotting your potatoes when they're forming. So anyway, just like everything else, when you're seed saving, you try to save the most beautiful that you can, and that is going to give you a better result later on. If you store them in this way, dry and dirty, rub off the mud, put them as close to freezing as possible at 1-2 degrees, 33, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, they should be 8 or 9 months. Really will keep that long. Sometimes they actually store them, and sometimes if you buy potatoes from the grocery store, you're buying them that might be 15 or 16 months old. I wouldn't go that far. 8 or 9 months is fine with me. Then the next potato crop comes in. Hopefully if we get lucky. Number 10, and then there actually is going to be a number 11. Number 10, any and all flowers, annual, biennial, and perennial, especially culinary, cilantro, dill, basil, nasturtium, medicinal, calendula, lovage, Korean mint, comfrey, nicotiana, which is a type of tobacco, nettles, and for pollinators, things like cosmos, bachelor button, poppy, and borage. These are highly popular at seed festivals and online. They're very, very easy to save from. Most, if not all, are outbreeding plants. So if you're going to save, say, a type of cosmos, make sure that you just grow one type or do that distance separation. Or if you don't mind, you can grow multiple types and then you just have multiple colorations later on. But if you really want just an orange cosmos, or if you really just want a bachelor button, or if you really just want a Tiana jasmine, then right. Anyway, if the species name is the same, then they will cross right next to a purple basil, and they will not cross. Pretty cool. And then again, they're highly popular at seed festivals and online, and even better for all the insect friends that are in your garden. So number 11, to complete the three sisters, if you are into it, you put corn, either sweet, open pollinator, or heirloom, a kind of a milling corn, a dry corn. And this is actually, I was just thinking about this today, this is probably the best grain that us home growers, us homesteaders could grow on our own farms, because one huge ear of corn produces just a ton of grain, which if we have a grinding mill, which we have, an old hand crank grinding mill, then you just have a ton of corn flour. And this is what people used to eat back in the day. They used to eat beans with corn with their winter squash. Corn is a grass, very, very simple, doesn't have a flower. It has a tassel that comes up, and then when the silks come out, which is going to be the corn, when you plant corn, you want to make sure you have multiple rows or a patch that's big enough that you have multiple spacings around. So for all corn, because this is an outbreeding plant, they also need to be separated. Some people say by half a mile, which is actually 1 kilometer. So yeah, there you go. Those are the ones you should be seed saving from. If you ever have any questions, hopefully the live chat is working, but if you ever have any questions, you can always post it to the show. I always check. And you can ask me any question about anything that you want to save seed from. This is a very, very important thing for us growers to do. Many, many farmers do not do this. Yeah, I'm sorry if just me, or maybe it's my computer. I definitely have slow internet. So one day that'll be fixed. So I hope it gets better one day. Maybe that's why people come and go. But anyway, excuse me. Hopefully get this fixed in the future. It looks like my microphone is working, but maybe it's not. Anyway, we'll continue on. Hopefully it's all as well. So the process of biennial plants is more complicated. Start planting things like cabbages or broccoli and seed save those, or carrots, beets, onions, leeks. Those vegetables either need to be stored over the winter outside by putting a heavy mulch, or they need to be left in the ground, or they need to be pulled out and stored and then replanted in the spring to let go to flower. So it is a little bit more complicated, but if you are interested, again, look at the book Seed to Seed by Susan Ashworth, and you should be able to find good information. So final thoughts, and hopefully this my voice comes through good here. These shows are for you. This is a vegan safe space where we seek to eliminate all exploitation of all floral and faunal beings to the greatest extent possible. This is a place you can come every month, or the next show is going to be in 6 weeks, or every 6 weeks, and you can just feel comfortable that I'm not going to talk about why you should be raising animals, and I'm not going to talk about why you should be using manure. So this is a place for you as a vegan to feel comfortable. I hope you appreciate that. I know that for me, when I read something and it's specifically vegan related, when I'm reading a gardening book and it's specifically vegan related, I feel a lot more comfortable than if I have to sift through when somebody is talking about the exploitation of our beings. So anyway, on that note, the next show is going to be quite some distance away. It's the 29th of August. As always, I will share harvest abundance tips and best practices. And between now and then, I'm going to hope that I get my audio correct, but kind of seems like maybe there's a little bit of issue. Anyway, I hope everybody had a good time. If you were able to hear, thank you. Again, fiber optic cable is on its way. And hopefully I will have that up by next time. Okay, bye-bye.